At 2:47 this afternoon, Treasury Secretary Jay Carney stood up from his chair in the Roosevelt Room, stated, "I cannot and will not support this economic suicide," and walked out of the most important trade policy meeting in a decade. 12 minutes later, at 2:59 p.m., he submitted his resignation letter to the president. By 3:15 p.m., three major corporations announced immediate layoffs affecting 47,000 workers. At 4:23 p.m., the Congressional Budget Office released an emergency assessment showing Trump's expanded tariff program would eliminate 420,000 jobs within 6 months. This is not a cabinet disagreement. This is not a policy dispute. This is the Treasury Secretary of the United States walking out on a president whose trade war has triggered what Carney called the most reckless economic gamble in modern American history. Subscribe immediately, because what you are about to see is how a trade policy crisis becomes a constitutional crisis when cabinet officials choose resignation over compliance. At 2:47 p.m., the meeting in the Roosevelt Room included the President, Treasury Secretary Carney, Commerce Secretary Raimondo, Trade Representative Tai, and Chief of Staff Meadows. According to sources present, the president announced his intention to impose 60% tariffs on Chinese goods, 40% on European imports, and 25% on Mexican products, effective Monday morning. Carney responded immediately. Sources report he stated the policy would trigger immediate retaliation, destroy supply chains, and cause unemployment not seen since 2008. The president reportedly replied that American workers would benefit from protected jobs. Carney then stood up, declared he could not support economic suicide, and left the room. Hit that like button right now if you understand what just happened. The Treasury Secretary just resigned rather than implement a trade policy he believes will crash the economy. The algorithm decides what breaks through. You decide whether this analysis reaches people who need to see it. At 2:59 p.m., 12 minutes after walking out, Carney submitted his resignation. The letter, obtained by sources, states, "I cannot in good conscience implement policies that will devastate American families, destroy decades of economic progress, and undermine our nation's credibility with allies. The proposed tariff expansion represents an abdication of fiscal responsibility." At 3:15 p.m., Ford Motor Company announced 15,000 layoffs, citing tariff uncertainty. General Electric announced 12,000 job cuts. Apple stated it would delay $8 billion in domestic investment. Three major companies, 27,000 jobs lost within 30 minutes of the Treasury Secretary's resignation. At 3:34 p.m., Senate Finance Committee Chair Wyden announced emergency hearings for tomorrow morning. House Ways and Means Committee Chair Smith stated Congress would vote on tariff limitation legislation by Friday. Speaker Jeffries called the president's trade policy economic warfare against American workers. Drop a comment right now. Tell me if you think the Treasury Secretary was right to resign, or if he should have stayed to fight internally. I am reading every response because this question reveals how Americans view the balance between cabinet loyalty and economic responsibility. At 4:23 p.m., the Congressional Budget Office released its emergency assessment. The numbers are devastating. 420,000 job losses within 6 months, $180 billion in reduced GDP, inflation rising to 7.2% by year end, consumer prices increasing 12% on affected goods. The CBO analysis concludes the tariff expansion would trigger the worst economic contraction since the Great Recession. But here is what makes this a constitutional crisis, not just an economic one. The president has statutory authority to impose tariffs under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974. Congress delegated that power decades ago. Now Congress wants it back. But the question is whether they can reclaim delegated authority when they disagree with how it is being used. Subscribe to this channel right now if you have not already, because what I am about to show you is the legal and political battle over who controls America's trade policy when the stakes are 420,000 jobs and economic stability. The constitutional framework is clear but complex. Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, but Congress passed laws in 1962 and 1974 delegating emergency tariff authority to the president. Those statutes remain in effect. The president is acting within his legal authority, even if economists believe he is acting recklessly. The question is whether Congress can unilaterally reclaim delegated power or whether they need the president's signature on new legislation. If Congress passes a bill limiting tariff authority and the president vetoes it, they need 2/3 majorities in both chambers to override. That means 67 senators and 290 House members must vote to constrain presidential trade authority. Here is the current math. The Senate has 51 Democrats, 49 Republicans. For a veto override, Democrats Democrats need 16 Republicans to join them. The House has 221 Democrats, 214 Republicans. Democrats need 69 Republicans for a veto override. The question is whether the economic consequences of the tariff policy will drive enough Republicans to break with their party's president. At 5:47 p.m., Senate Majority Leader Schumer held a press conference. He announced the Senate would vote Thursday on the Congressional Trade Authority Restoration Act, which would require congressional approval for any tariff exceeding 15% or affecting more than $50 billion in trade. Schumer stated he believes he has the votes for passage, but acknowledged a veto override would be challenging. At 6:12 p.m., House Speaker Jeffries announced the House would vote Wednesday on identical legislation. She stated 12 Republicans had privately committed to support the bill, with more likely after seeing today's corporate announcements and job loss projections. At 6:34 p.m., Federal Reserve Chairman Powell issued an emergency statement calling the tariff expansion deeply concerning for monetary policy stability. Powell noted the Fed cannot offset tariff-induced inflation through interest rate policy alone. Minutes later, the Dow Jones Industrial Average closed down 847 points, representing the worst single-day decline since March 2020. At 7:15 p.m., the National Association of Manufacturers released internal polling showing 73% of member companies would accelerate overseas relocation if tariffs exceed 40%. The Chamber of Commerce announced it would spend $50 million on advertising opposing the tariff expansion. Labor unions, typically supportive of trade protection, split dramatically, with the AFL-CIO supporting congressional action and the Teamsters maintaining presidential support. At 7:47 p.m., China's Ministry of Commerce announced immediate preparation of retaliatory tariffs targeting $200 billion in American agricultural exports. European Union Trade Commissioner Dombrovskis stated the EU would respond proportionally and swiftly to any tariff increases. Mexico threatened to suspend USMCA cooperation on energy and immigration enforcement. At 8:23 p.m., Republican Senators Collins, Romney, and Murkowski jointly announced they would vote to override any presidential veto of tariff limitation legislation. Senator Cornyn, previously supportive of Presidential Trade Authority, stated he was deeply reconsidering his position after consulting with Texas manufacturers. 3 Republican governors from manufacturing states issued a joint statement calling the tariff policy economically devastating for their constituents. At 8:56 p.m., sources inside the White House reported emergency meetings in the West Wing as staff scrambled to find a Treasury Secretary replacement before markets opened Tuesday. Chief of Staff Meadows reportedly urged the president to delay tariff implementation, while senior advisor Miller pushed for immediate acceleration to demonstrate resolve. Turn on notifications and set them to all, because this is moving faster than any trade crisis in modern history. By Thursday evening, we will know whether Congress can constrain presidential tariff authority or whether the president can implement what his own Treasury Secretary called economic suicide. Here are the 6 indicators we are watching over the next 72 hours that will determine how this crisis resolves. Indicator 1, does any other cabinet member resign? If Commerce Secretary Raimondo or Trade Representative Tai follow Carney, it signals broader cabinet rebellion against the tariff policy. If they remain, it suggests the president maintains sufficient support to proceed. Indicator 2, do more companies announce layoffs or investment delays? The initial 27,000 jobs lost represent just the beginning. If major employers continue exodus announcements, political pressure on Congress intensifies. If companies wait to see policy implementation, Congress loses urgency arguments. Indicator 3, how many Republicans break ranks on the congressional votes? Wednesday and Thursday will reveal whether economic consequences overcome party loyalty. 12 House Republicans is a start, but 69 are needed for veto override. 16 Senate Republicans must choose economic stability over presidential support. Indicator 4, does the president moderate the tariff proposal? If he reduces percentages or delays implementation, it reduces congressional pressure for immediate action. If he accelerates the timeline or expands scope, it increases crisis momentum. Indicator 5, how do financial markets respond? If stocks crash, bond yields spike, or the dollar weakens dramatically, it creates political pressure no member of Congress can ignore. Market stability might allow some Republicans to maintain presidential support. Indicator 6, do any foreign governments announce immediate retaliation? If China, Mexico, or European allies announce counter tariffs before the policy takes effect, it demonstrates real-world consequences that congressional fence-sitters cannot dismiss. Here are the 3 scenarios for how this constitutional and economic crisis resolves. Scenario 1, congressional override succeeds. The House votes Wednesday with 75 Republicans joining Democrats. The Senate votes Thursday with 18 Republicans crossing party lines. The president vetoes Friday, but Congress overrides Monday. Presidential tariff authority is constrained. The economic crisis is averted, but executive power suffers a historic defeat. This is the legislative victory scenario where economic consequences drive bipartisan action. Scenario 2, congressional override fails narrowly. The House passes the bill Wednesday, but the Senate falls short Thursday with only 14 Republicans supporting override. The president proceeds with tariff implementation Monday morning. Within 30 days, 200,000 jobs are lost, inflation spikes, and Congress tries again with broader support. This is the delayed reckoning scenario where economic pain drives eventual action. Scenario 3, presidential tariff authority survives. Congress cannot muster override majorities. The president implements tariffs Monday. The economy enters recession by fall, but presidential supporters argue short-term pain creates long-term gain. 420,000 jobs are lost, but executive tariff power remains intact. This is the executive authority triumph scenario where political loyalty overcomes economic evidence. Let me show you the historical parallel that makes this moment unprecedented. In 1930, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, raising tariffs to historic levels. The result was economic disaster, global retaliation, and deepened depression. But that was Congress acting, not a president using delegated authority against congressional opposition. In 1971, Nixon imposed wage and price controls using emergency economic powers. Congress eventually constrained those authorities. In 2018-2020, Trump used Section 232 and Section 301 tariffs, but never at this scale and never after his Treasury Secretary resigned in protest. This is the first time in American history that a president has faced cabinet rebellion, congressional opposition, and corporate exodus simultaneously over trade policy. It is testing whether the post-1962 framework of delegated tariff authority can survive when economic and political costs become unbearable. What I know for certain right now, Treasury Secretary Carney resigned at 2:59 p.m. rather than implement what he called economic suicide. 3 major corporations announced 27,000 layoffs within hours. The CBO projects forward 20,000 job losses from the president's tariff expansion. Congress will vote Wednesday and Thursday on constraining presidential trade authority. The votes will determine whether economic consequences can overcome political loyalty. This is not about supporting or opposing the president politically. This is about whether the American constitutional system includes effective mechanisms for preventing economic policies that experts believe will cause massive unemployment and recession. The president has legal authority to impose these tariffs. Congress has legal authority to constrain that power. The question is whether they have the political will when 420,000 jobs hang in the balance. The House votes Wednesday, the Senate votes Thursday. If Congress musters veto override majorities, the president faces his first major legislative defeat. If Congress falls short, the tariffs take effect Monday, and the economic consequences begin immediately. Stay with this channel. Turn on notifications. When Congress votes, when the president responds, when the economic impacts begin, you will see the analysis here immediately. This is not over. This is a Treasury Secretary choosing resignation over compliance and Congress deciding whether economic catastrophe justifies constraining presidential authority. The next 72 hours determine whether 420,000 American jobs are saved or sacrificed to executive power.